Some of my disclosures. So I was indeed in New Delhi about 5 years ago when I met Dr. Nitesh. I was there to talk about immune checkpoint inhibitors when the data was just coming out, and many people were still wondering, is this all a myth? Can immunotherapy actually treat lung cancer in a metastatic setting? But well, we now know that we are way past that point. We're not even talking about this in stage 3 disease and maybe even some new adjuvant approaches. I would love to have come back. I couldn't have any chance to go to the Taj Mahal the last time round because I was worked too hard by Dr. Nitesh. So I hope I'll be invited back in the future. So I think we can all argue till the cows come home, and perhaps many views in a room of 100 doctors. We had 200 views about a single station N2 disease, but that's not the purview of today's talk. It will be the multi-station N2 disease, where we've all agreed that concurrent chemoradiation is the standard of care. And we know that in recent TNM changes in the 8th edition, we know that size does matter, and some of these patients who have otherwise be a T2, they're actually upgraded to a T3. And for example, 5 to 7 cm now T3, and more than 7 cm is a T4. And we can see that the bulk of the stage migrations with the 8th edition is actually due to the size changes, although there's some other changes due to things like T3 diaphragm now being a T4. So I think for concurrent chemoradiotherapy, much has been done, much has been said and argued about what is the exact chemotherapy backbone we should be giving: cisplatin etoposide, carboplatin, paclitaxel, cis-pem. I think this really just puts everything into perspective that the immune checkpoint inhibitors, durvalumab, adjuvant post-concurrent chemoradiation really was the biggest change, the greatest landmark development in the stage 3 setting for non-small cell lung cancer. So we look back at really old publications. This is from the year 2002, Katie Albane, the SWOG study showing cisplatin etoposide, extremely toxic regimen. And we'll try to improve on this. Walter Curran and colleagues, carboplatin paclitaxel, much better tolerated. Sometimes we'll even split it into a weekly dose. And more recently, the PROCLAIM trial of cis-pemetrexed versus cis-etoposide, even though the trial was stopped for not really meeting its primary goal, but it's generally deemed that this is roughly equivalent to cis-etoposide. So I think really it doesn't quite matter which approach you go with, as long as the patient gets concurrent chemoradiation. And we know that this is the preferred approach because Walter Curran showed that concurrent approach is actually superior to that of a sequential approach. So, after this, various strategies were tried, trying, to add some chemotherapy before concurrent chemoradiation, trying to have surgery after concurrent chemoradiation, or even adjuvant treatment post CCRT. So another study by Everett Vokes, in short, introducing chemotherapy before CCRT showed no benefit. The two curves, the Kaplan-Meier curves, hug each other. And how about Katie Albane's intergroup 0139 trial? Well, we know this is a positive trial, but this is only on the assumption that the patient undergoes a lobectomy and not a pneumonectomy. And this is something that is a little bit difficult to really predict. And a lot of my surgeons are still quite worried about operating after concurrent chemoradiation. Which brings us now to the last category. We couldn't get much benefit in putting stuff before CCRT or surgery after CCRT. How about using systemic treatment after CCRT? So the Hosier Oncology Group did a trial of consolidative docetaxel after CCRT with cis-etoposide. No difference at all in the PFS and the overall survival. And the SWOG group did a trial of maintenance gefitinib or placebo after CCRT and docetaxel consolidation. And wow, okay, we see a difference. But look, it's the placebo that's on top of the gefitinib arm in the overall survival. So it's deleterious, and the PFS was the same. So I think everything was really pretty much in the doldrums for stage 3, and everyone was very disappointed until, in 2017 in ESMO Congress in Madrid, the initial data of the Pacific trial, which is double-blind placebo-controlled phase 3 study of durvalumab after concurrent chemoradiation in patients with stage 3 locally advanced unresectable non-small cell lung cancer. So I think everyone's familiar with this protocol. Patients randomized 2:1. Durvalumab after concurrent chemoradiation had to start within 42 days or else placebo. And this is really laudable that they actually had a placebo arm for this for the duration of 12 months. Primary endpoint was PFS, secondary endpoint is response rates, duration of response, and also overall survival was a co-primary endpoint. So we look at the patients, they are really our typical stage 3 non-small cell lung cancer patients. You know, majority of them are current or former smokers. The overwhelming majority of patients in this trial were stage 3, A and B. What I found was a bit more interesting, or they're a bit more non-squamous than squamous. PD-L1s, about a third are unknown. And about the usual, a quarter being on the high side. Radiation, the bulk had the standard dose of radiation. We know that doses above 60, 66 gray really do not have much benefit. And the bulk of the patients actually had a PR. So we know that the patients in the two arms, right, approximately 42.7% of them completed all 12 months of treatment versus 30.1% of placebo. So you can get at least about 40% of patients who finished the treatment. And the patients could actually receive subsequent treatment after discontinuation, about a third of them, as compared to 43% with the placebo. So we look at the progression-free survival curves. We can see that at the landmark time points of 12 months, it's 55.9% versus 35.3%. At the 18-month mark, it's 44.2% versus 27%. And as we all know from the prior curves, this compares much more favorably as with prior data. So we look at the forest plot. We can see that virtually everybody benefits. EGFR status, a very common question at all international meetings, very small numbers, very wide confidence interval, but still seems to land on this side favoring durvalumab. And quite interestingly, PD-L1 status does not seem to predict who will benefit, because whether be it high, low, or unknown, it all falls nicely on the side of durvalumab. So we know that the benefit of giving the durvalumab is not just confined to being a radiosensitizer. We find that there are distant metastases, like in the brain, in the liver, for which it's lower, and durvalumab compared to the placebo. So this is not just a radiosensitizer. And the distant metastasis of death, again, it favors durvalumab versus placebo, 23.2 months versus 14.6 months median. And safety for grade 3-4 is actually comparable to that of placebo. And for discontinuation, yes, about 50% more discontinuation in durvalumab than placebo, but still at relatively low levels. The common AEs would be that of cough, pneumonitis, some pyrexia, some rash, hypothyroidism. But we look at the grade 3-4 clinically significant, actually it compares quite favorably with placebo. Radiation pneumonitis, which is always a very feared thing. Any grades are numerically high in durvalumab, but for clinically significant, just slightly higher. And for actually grade 5, which is death, it's actually comparable. So I think at ESMO, there was a critical and landmark finding that this was the first time that you could actually get a PFS improvement in this population where virtually every other strategy other than concurrent chemotherapy had failed. And the overall response rates of 28% versus 16% was something that hadn't been achieved before. At that point in time, the overall survival was still blinded, but we really noticed that even distant metastases were impacted. So about a year later, New England Journal of Medicine, Antonia and colleagues report the overall survival, and we can see that the median overall survival at 24-month mark, we hit about 66.3% versus 55.6%. And this is, of course, much better than historical. So now I'll show you my patient who was in the early access program of durvalumab, 65-year-old Chinese gentleman, heavy smoker, COPD, FEV1, FEV6 15%, poor effort tolerance, left lung, NSCLC, squamous cell carcinoma, 8 addition, T3, 5 to 7 cm, N1, M0, stage 3A, non-small cell lung cancer. He had 2 cycles of cisplatin, gemcitabine, could not tolerate any further chemotherapy, and moved him on to sequential radiotherapy. And he had 1 year of adjuvant durvalumab. This was a scan initially from China, showing the large mass and also the hilar lymph node. This was his residual mass, FDG uptake after chemotherapy followed by sequential radiotherapy. And this was midway through his durvalumab. You can see that it's virtually resolved. And this is after completion of 1 year of durvalumab, you can see some really linear plate-like atelectasis consistent with the radiotherapy fields. Otherwise, he's well. You can spot a little inhaler back there because he's got very, very bad COPD, but he's given me his consent to show his photo, tell people about how great this drug is. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention.